Welcome to Chapter 6 and 7 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. The story continues to move along in its tranquil pace, not big things happening chapter by chapter, but it's slowly building. We're learning little bits and pieces about Helen Graham. What's her story? She will divulge practically nothing. But we see her through the understanding or through the eyes of Gilbert Markham. And what's happening with him is he's starting to fall for Helen. He's not thinking about Eliza as much, and there's a little bit of tension there too. So let's just read and see what's going to happen. Again, I will put in illustrations. I like to do that. Hopefully it livens up the reading. I hope you're enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. Chapter 6, Progression. During the next 4 months, I did not enter Mrs. Graham's house, nor she mine, but still the ladies continued to talk about her, and still our acquaintance continued, though slowly, to advance, for all their talk I paid but little attention to that, when it related to the fair hermit, I mean. And the only information I derived from it was that one fine frosty day she had ventured to take her little boy as far as the vicarage, and that unfortunately nobody was at home but Miss Millward. Nevertheless, she had sat a long time, and by all accounts they had found a good deal to say to each other, and parted with a mutual desire to meet again. But Mary liked children, and fond mammas like those who can duly appreciate their treasures. But sometimes I saw her myself, not only when she came to church, but when she was out on the hills with her son, whether taking a long purpose-like walk, or on special fine days, leisurely rambling over the moor or the bleak pasture lands surrounding the old hall, herself with a book in her hand, her son gambolling about her. And on any of these occasions, when I caught sight of her in my solitary walks or rides, or while following my agricultural pursuits, I generally contrived to meet or overtake her, for I rather liked to see Mrs. Graham and to talk to her, and I decidedly liked to talk to her little companion, whom, when once the ice of his shyness was fairly broken, I found to be a very amiable, intelligent, and entertaining little fellow, and we soon became excellent friends. How much to the gratification of his mamma I cannot undertake to say. I suspected at first that she was desirous of throwing cold water on this growing intimacy, to quench, as it were, the kindling flame of our friendship, but discovering at length, in spite of her prejudice against me, that I was perfectly harmless and even well-intentioned, and that between myself and my dog, her son derived a great deal of pleasure from the acquaintance that he would not otherwise have known, she ceased to object, and even welcomed my coming with a smile. As for Arthur, he would shout his welcome from afar and run to meet me 50 yards from his mother's side. If I happened to be on horseback, he was sure to get a canter or a gallop, or if there was one of those draft horses within an available distance, he was treated to a steady ride upon that, which served his turn almost as well. But his mother would always follow and trudge beside him, not so much, I believe, to ensure his safe conduct, but to see that I instilled no objectionable notions into his infant mind. For she was ever on the watch, and would never allow him to be taken out of her sight. What pleased her best of all was to see him romping and racing with Sancho, while I walked by her side, not, I fear, for love of my company, though I sometimes deluded myself with that idea, as so much as for the delight she took in seeing her son thus happily engaged in the enjoyment of those active sports, so invigorating to his tender frame, yet so seldom exercised for want of playmates suited to his years. And perhaps her pleasure was sweetened not a little by the fact of my being with her instead of with him, and therefore incapable of doing him any injury directly or indirectly, designedly or otherwise. Small thanks to her for that same. But sometimes I believe she really had some little gratification in conversing with me. And one bright February morning, during 20 minutes' stroll along the moor, she laid aside her usual asperity and reserve, and fairly entered into conversation with me. discoursing with so much eloquence, the depth of thought and feeling on a subject happily coinciding with my own ideas, and looking so beautiful withal, that I went home enchanted, and on the way, morally, started to find myself thinking that, after all, it would perhaps be better to spend one's days with such a woman than with Eliza Millward, and that I figuratively blushed for my inconsistency. On entering the parlor, I found Eliza there, with Rose and no one else. The surprise was not altogether so agreeable as it ought to have been. We chatted together for a long time, but I found her rather frivolous, and even a little insipid, compared with the more mature and earnest Mrs. Graham. Alas, for human consistency! However, thought I ought not to marry Eliza, since my mother so strongly objects to it, and I ought not to delude the girl with the idea that I intended to do so. Now, if this mood continue, I shall have less difficulty in emancipating my affections from her soft yet unrelenting sway, and though Mrs. Graham might be equally objectionable, I may be permitted, like the doctors, to cure a greater evil by a less, for I shall not fall seriously in love with the young widow, I think, nor she with me, that's certain. But if I find a little pleasure in her society, I may surely be allowed to seek it, and if the star of her divinity be bright enough to dim the lustre of Eliza's, so much the better, but I scarcely can think it. And thereafter I seldom suffered a fine day to pass without paying a visit to Wildfell, about the time my new acquaintance usually left her hermitage, but so frequently was I balked in my expectations of another interview, so changeable was she in her times of coming forth, and in her places of resort, so transient were the occasional glimpses I was able to obtain, that I felt half inclined to think she took as much pains to avoid my company as I to seek hers. But this was too disagreeable a supposition to be entertained a moment after it could conveniently be dismissed. One calm, clear afternoon, however, in March, as I was superintending the rolling of the meadowland and the repairing of a hedge in the valley, I saw Mrs. Graham down by the brook, with a sketchbook in her hand, absorbed in the exercise of her favorite art, while Arthur was putting on the time with constructing dams and breakwaters in the shallow stony stream. I was rather in want of amusement, and so rare an opportunity was not to be neglected. So, leaving both meadow and hedge, I quickly repaired to the spot, but not before Sancho, who immediately upon perceiving his young friend scoured at full gallop the intervening space, and pounced upon him with an impetuous mirth that precipitated the child almost into the middle of the beck. But happily the stones preserved him from any serious wetting, while their smoothness prevented his being too much hurt to laugh at the untoward event. Mrs. Graham was studying the distinctive characters of the different varieties of trees in their winter nakedness, and copying with a spirited though delicate touch their various ramifications. She did not talk much, but I stood and watched the progress of her pencil. It was a pleasure to behold. It was so dexterously guided by those fair and graceful fingers, but ere long their dexterity became impaired. They began to hesitate, to tremble slightly, and to make false strokes, and then suddenly came to a pause, while their owner laughingly raised her face to mine, and told me that her sketch did not profit by my superintendence. Then, said I, I'll talk to Arthur till you've done. I should like to have a ride, Mr. Markham, if mamma will let me, said the child. What on, my boy? I think there's a horse in the field, replied he, pointing to where the strong black mare was pulling on the roller. No, no, Arthur, it's too far, objected his mother. But I promised to bring him safe back after a turn or two up and down the meadow, and when she looked at his eager face, she smiled and let him go. It was the first time she had even allowed me to take him so much as half a field's length from her side. Enthroned upon his monstrous steed, and solemnly proceeding up and down the wide, steep field, he looked the very incarnation of quiet, gleeful satisfaction and delight. The rolling, however, was soon completed, And when I dismounted the gallant horseman and restored him to his mother, she seemed rather displeased at my keeping him so long. She had shut up her sketch-book and been probably for some minutes impatiently waiting his return. It was now high time to go home, she said, and would have bid me good evening, but I was not going to leave her yet. I accompanied her halfway up the hill. She became more sociable, and I was beginning to be very happy. But on coming within sight of the grim old hall, she stood still and turned towards me while she spoke, as if expecting I should go no further. That the conversation would end here, and I should now take leave and depart, as indeed it was time to do. For the clear, cold eve was fast declining. The sun had set, and the gibbous moon was visibly brightening in the pale grey sky. But a feeling almost of compassion riveted me to the spot. It seemed hard to leave her to such a lonely, comfortless home. I looked up at it, silent and grim. It frowned before us. A faint red light was gleaming from the lower windows of one wing, but all the other windows were in darkness, and many exhibited their black cavernous gulfs entirely destitute of glazing or framework. "Do you not find it a desolate place to live in?" said I, after a moment of silent contemplation. "I do sometimes," replied she. "On winter evenings, when Arthur is in bed and I am sitting there alone, hearing the bleak wind moaning round me, and howling through the ruinous old chambers, no books or occupations can repress the dismal thoughts and apprehensions that come crowding in. But it is folly to give way to such weakness, I know. If Rachel is satisfied with such a life, why should not I? Indeed, I cannot be too thankful for such an asylum while it is left me." The closing sentence was uttered in an undertone, as if spoken rather to herself than to me. She then bid me good evening and withdrew. I had not proceeded many steps on my way homeward when I perceived Mr. Lawrence on his pretty grey pony coming up the rugged lane that crossed over the hill-top. I went a little out of my way to speak to him, for we had not met for some time. "Was that Mrs. Graham you were speaking to just now?" said he, after the first few words of greeting had passed between us. "Yes." "Humph! I thought so." He looked contemplatively at his horse's mane, as if he had some serious cause of dissatisfaction with it, or something else. "Well, what then?" "Oh, nothing," replied he. "Only I thought you disliked her," he quietly added, curling his classic lip with a slightly sarcastic smile. "Suppose I did, mayn't a man change his mind on further acquaintance?" "Yes, of course," returned he, nicely reducing an entanglement in the pony's redundant hoary mane. Then suddenly turning to me and fixing his shy hazel eyes upon me with a steady penetrating gaze, he added, "Then you have changed your mind?" "I can't say that I have exactly. No, I think I hold the same opinion respecting her as before, but slightly ameliorated." "Oh." He looked round for something else to talk about, and glancing up at the moon, made some remark about the beauty of the evening, which I did not answer, as being irrelevant to the subject. "Lawrence," said I, calmly looking at him in the face, "are you in love with Mrs. Graham?" Instead of him being deeply offended at this, as I more than half expected he would, the first start of surprise at the audacious question was followed by a tittering laugh, as if he was highly amused at the idea. "I? In love with her?" repeated he. "What makes you dream of such a thing?" "From the interest you take in the progress of my acquaintance with the lady, and the changes of my opinion concerning her. I thought you might be jealous." He laughed again. "Jealous? No, but I thought you were going to marry Eliza Millward." "You thought wrong then. I am not going to marry either one or the other that I know of." "Then I think you'd better let them alone." "Are you going to marry Jane Wilson?" He colored and played with the mane again, but answered, "No, I think not." "Then you had better let her alone." "She won't let me alone," he might have said, but he only looked silly and said nothing for the space of half a minute, and then made another attempt to turn the conversation, and this time I let it pass, for he had borne enough. Another word on this subject would have been like the last atom that breaks the camel's back. I was too late for tea, but my mother had kindly kept the teapot and muffin warm upon the hobs, and though she scolded me a little, readily admitted my excuses. And when I complained of the flavor of the overdrawn tea, she poured the remainder into the slop basin, and bade Rose put some fresh into the pot, and reboil the kettle, which offices were performed with great commotion and certain remarkable comments. Well, if it had been me now, I would have had no tea at all. If it had been Fergus even, he would have had to put up with such as there was, and been told to be thankful, for it was far too good for him. But you, we can't do too much for you. It is always so. If there's anything particularly nice at table, Mamma winks and nods to me to abstain from it. And if I don't attend to that, she whispers, "Don't eat so much of that, Rose. Gilbert will like it for his supper." I'm nothing at all in the parlor. It's, "Come, Rose, put away your things, and let's have the room nice and tidy against they come in, and keep up a good fire. Gilbert likes a cheerful fire." In the kitchen, "Make that pie a large one, Rose. I dare say the boys'll be hungry." And, "Don't put so much pepper in. They'll not like it, I'm sure." Or, "Rose, don't put so many spices in the pudding. Gilbert likes it plain." Or, "Mind you put plenty of currants in the cake. Fergus likes plenty." If I say, "Well, Mamma, I don't," I'm told I ought not to think of myself. Rose, in all household matters, we have only two things to consider. First, what's proper to be done, and secondly, what's most agreeable to the gentlemen of the house. Anything will do for the ladies. "And very good doctrine, too," said my mother. "Gilbert thinks so, I'm sure." "Very convenient doctrine for us, at all events," said I. "But if you really would study my pleasure, mother, you must consider your own comfort and convenience a little more than you do. As for Rose, I have no doubt she'll take care of herself. And whenever she does make a sacrifice or perform a remarkable act of devotedness, she'll take good care to let me know the extent of it. But for you, I might sink into the grossest condition of self-indulgence and carelessness about the wants of others, from the mere habit of being constantly cared for myself and having all my wants anticipated or immediately supplied, while left in total ignorance of what is done for me. If Rose did not enlighten me now and then, and I should receive all your kindness as a matter of course, and never know how much I owe you." "Ah, and you never will know, Gilbert, till you're married. Then, when you've got some trifling, self-conceited girl like Eliza Millward, careless of everything but her own immediate pleasure and advantage, or some misguided, obstinate woman like Mrs. Graham, ignorant of her principal duties, and clever only in what concerns her least to know, then you'll find the difference. It will do me good, mother. I was not sent into the world merely to exercise the good capacities and good feelings of others, was I? But to exert my own towards them. And when I marry, I shall expect to find more pleasure in making my wife happy and comfortable than in being made so by her. I would rather give than receive." "Oh, that's all nonsense, my dear. It's mere boys' talk, that. You'll soon tire of petting and humoring your wife, be she ever so charming, and then comes the trial. Well, then, we must bear one another's burdens. Then you must fall each into your proper place. You'll do your business, and she, if she's worthy of you, will do hers. But it's your business to please yourself, and hers to please you. I'm sure your poor dear father was as good a husband as ever lived, and after the first 6 months or so were over, I should as soon have expected him to fly as to put himself out of his way to pleasure me. He always said I was a good wife, and even did my duty. And he always did his, bless him. He was steady and punctual, seldom found fault without a reason, always did justice to my good dinners, and hardly ever spoiled my cookery by delay. And that's as much as any woman can expect of any man. Is it so, Halford? Is that the extent of your domestic virtues? And does your happy wife expect no more?" End of chapter 6. Chapter 7, The Excursion. Not many days after this, on a mild, sunny morning, rather soft underfoot, for the last fall of snow was only just wasted away, leaving yet a thin ridge here and there, lingering on the fresh green grass beneath the hedges, but beside them already, The young primroses were peeping from among their moist, dark foliage, and the lark above was singing of summer and hope and love and every heavenly thing. I was out on the hillside, enjoying these delights, and looking after the well-being of my young lambs and their mothers, when on glancing round me, I beheld 3 persons ascending from the vale below. They were Eliza Millward, Fergus, and Rose. So I crossed the field to meet them, and being told they were going to Wildfell Hall, I declared myself willing to go with them, and offering my arm to Eliza, who readily accepted it in lieu of my brothers, told the latter he might go back, for I would accompany the ladies. I beg your pardon, exclaimed he. It's the ladies that are accompanying me, not I them. You had all had a peep at this wonderful stranger but me, and I could endure my wretched ignorance no longer. Come what would, I must be satisfied. So I begged Rose to go with me to the hall and introduce me to her at once. She swore she would not unless Miss Eliza would go too. So I ran to the vicarage and fetched her, and we've come hooked all the way, as fond as a pair of lovers, and now you've taken her from me, and you want to deprive me of my walk and my visit besides. Go back to your fields and your cattle, you lubberly fellow. You're not fit to associate with ladies and gentlemen like us, that have nothing to do but to run snooking about to our neighbors' houses, peeping into their private corners and scenting out their secrets, and picking holes in their coats when we don't find them ready-made to our hands. You don't understand such refined sources of enjoyment. Can't you both go? Suggested Eliza, disregarding the latter half of the speech. Yes, both to be sure, cried Rose. The more the merrier, and I'm sure we shall want all the cheerfulness we can carry with us to that great dark gloomy room, with its narrow latticed windows and its dismal old furniture, unless she shows us into her studio again. So we went, all in a body, and the meagre old maidservant that opened the door ushered us into an apartment, such as Rose had described to me as the scene of her first introduction to Mrs. Graham, a tolerably spacious and lofty room, but obscurely lighted by the old-fashioned windows, the ceiling, panels, and chimney-piece of grim black oak, the latter elaborately but not very tastefully carved, with tables and chairs to match, an old bookcase on one side of the fireplace stocked with a motley assemblage of books, and an elderly cabinet piano on the other. The lady was seated in a stiff, high-backed armchair, with a small round table containing a desk and a work-basket on one side of her, and her little boy on the other, who stood leaning his elbow on her knee and reading to her with wonderful fluency from a small volume that lay in her lap, while she rested her hand on his shoulder and abstractly played with his long, wavy curls that fell on his ivory neck. They struck me as forming a pleasing contrast to all the surrounding objects, but of course their position was immediately changed at our entrance. I could only observe the picture during the brief seconds that Rachel held the door for our admittance. I could not think Mrs. Graham was particularly delighted to see us. There was something indescribably chilly in her quiet, calm civility. But I did not talk much to her. Seating myself near the window, a little back from the circle, I called Arthur to me, and he and I and Sancho amused ourselves very pleasantly together, while the 2 young ladies baited his mother with small talk. And Fergus sat opposite with his legs crossed, and his hands in his breeches pockets, leaning back in his chair and staring now up at the ceiling, now straight forward at his hostess, in a manner that made me strongly inclined to kick him out of the room, now whistling sotto voce to himself a snatch of a favorite air, now interrupting the conversation or filling up the pause, as the case may be, with some most impertinent question or remark. At one time it amazes me, Mrs. Graham, how you could choose such a dilapidated, rickety old place as this to live in. If you couldn't afford to occupy the whole house and have it mended up, why couldn't you take a neat little cottage? Perhaps I was too proud, Mr. Fergus, replied she, smiling. Perhaps I took a particular fancy for this romantic old-fashioned place, but indeed it has many advantages over a cottage. In the first place, you see, the rooms are larger and more airy. In the second place, the unoccupied apartments, which I don't pay for, may serve as lumber rooms if I have anything to put in them, and they are very useful for my little boy to run about in on rainy days when he can't go out. And then there is the garden for him to play in, and for me to work in. You see, I have effected some little improvement already," continued she, turning to the window. "There is a bed of young vegetables in that corner, and here are some snowdrops and primroses already in bloom, and there, too, is a yellow crocus just opening in the sunshine. But then, how can you bear such a situation, your nearest neighbors 2 miles distant, and nobody looking in or passer by? Rose would go stark mad in such a place. She can't put on life unless she sees half a dozen fresh gowns and bonnets a day, and not to speak of the faces within. But you might sit watching all these windows all day long and never see so much as an old woman carrying her eggs to market." I am not sure the loneliness of this place was not one of its chief recommendations. I take no pleasure in watching people pass the windows, and I like to be quiet. Oh, as good as to say you wish we would all of us mind our own business and let you alone. No, I dislike an extensive acquaintance, but if I have a few friends, of course I am glad to see them occasionally. No one can be happy in eternal solitude. Therefore, Mr. Fergus, if you choose to enter my house as a friend, I will make you welcome. If not, I must confess I would rather you kept away. Then she turned and addressed some observations to Rose or Eliza. "And Mrs. Graham," said he again 5 minutes after, "we were disputing as we came along a question that you can readily decide for us, as it mainly regarded yourself, and indeed we often hold discussions about you, for some of us have nothing better to do than to talk about our neighbors' concerns, and we, the indigenous plants of the soil, have known each other so long and talked each other over so often that we are quite sick of that game. And so that if a stranger comes amongst us, makes an invaluable addition to our exhausted sources of amusement. Well, the question or questions you are requested to solve—" "Hold your tongue, Fergus," cried Rose, in a fever of apprehension and wrath. "I won't tell you. The questions you are requested to solve are these. First, concerning your birth, extraction, and previous residence. Some will have it that you are a foreigner, and some an Englishwoman, some a native of the north country, and some of the south. We say, well, Mr. Fergus, I'll tell you. I'm an Englishwoman, and I don't see why anyone should doubt it. And I was born in the country, neither in the extreme north nor south of our happy isle. And in the country I have chiefly passed my life, and now I hope you are satisfied, for I am not disposed to answer any more questions at present. Except this." "Nope, not one more," laughed she, and instantly quitting her seat, she sought refuge at the window by which I was seated, and in very desperation to escape my brother's persecutions, endeavored to draw me into conversation. "Mr. Markham," said she, her rapid utterance and heightened color too plainly evincing her disquietude, "have you forgotten the fine sea view we were speaking of some time ago? I think I must trouble you now to tell me the nearest way to it, for if this beautiful weather continue, I shall perhaps be able to walk there and take my sketch. I have exhausted every other subject for painting, and I long to see it." I was about to comply with her request, but Rose would not suffer me to proceed. "Oh, don't tell her, Gilbert," cried she. "She shall go with us. It's Bay you are thinking about, I suppose, Mrs. Graham. It's a very long walk, too far for you, and out of the question for Arthur. But we were thinking about making a picnic to see it some fine day. And if you will wait till settled fine weather comes, I'm sure we shall all be delighted to have you amongst us." Poor Mrs. Graham looked dismayed and attempted to make excuses, but Rose, either compassionating her lonely life or anxious to cultivate her acquaintance, was determined to have her, and every objection was overruled. She was told it would only be a small party and all friends, and that the best view of all was from cliffs, full 5 miles distant. "Just a nice walk for the gentlemen," continued Rose, "but the ladies will drive and walk by turns, for we shall have our pony carriage. which will be plenty large enough to contain little Arthur and 3 ladies, together with your sketching apparatus and our provisions." So the proposal was finally acceded to, and after some further discussion respecting the time and manner of the projected excursion, we rose and took our leave. But this was only March. A cold, wet April and 2 weeks of May passed over before we could venture forth on our expedition with the reasonable hope of obtaining that pleasure we sought in pleasant prospects, cheerful society, fresh air, good cheer, and exercise, without the alloy of bad roads, cold winds, or threatening clouds. Then, on a glorious morning, we gathered our forces and set forth. The company consisted of Mr. and Master Graham, Mary and Eliza Millward, Jane and Richard Wilson and Rose, Fergus and Gilbert Markham. Mr. Lawrence had been invited to join us, but for some reason best known to himself, he refused to give us his company. I had solicited the favor myself. When I did so, he hesitated and asked who were going. Upon my naming Miss Wilson among the rest, he seemed half inclined to go. But when I mentioned Mrs. Graham, thinking it might be a further inducement, it appeared to have a contrary effect, and he declined it altogether. And to confess the truth, the decision was not displeasing to me, though I could scarcely tell you why. It was about midday when we reached the place of our destination. Mrs. Graham walked all the way to the cliffs, and little Arthur walked the greater part of it too, for he was now much more hardy and active than when he first entered the neighborhood, and he did not like being in the carriage with strangers, while all his 4 friends, Mamma and Sancho and Mr. Markham and Miss Millward, were on foot, journeying far behind, or passing through distant fields and lanes. I have a very pleasant recollection of that walk along the hard, white, sunny road, shaded here and there with bright green trees and adorned with flowery banks and blossoming hedges of delicious fragrance, or through pleasant fields and lanes, all glorious in sweet flowers and brilliant verdure of delightful May. It was true, Eliza was not beside me, but she was with her friends in the pony carriage, as happy, I trusted, as I was, and even when we pedestrians, having forsaken the highway for a short cut across the fields, beheld the little carriage, far away, disappearing among the green embowering trees, I did not hate those trees for snatching the dear little bonnet and shawl from my sight, nor did I feel that all those intervening objects lay between my happiness and me, for, to confess the truth, I was too happy in the company of Mrs. Graham to regret the absence of Eliza Millward. The former, it is true, was most provokingly unsociable at first, seemingly bent on talking to no one but Mary Millward and Arthur. She and Mary journeyed along together, generally with the child between them. But where the road permitted, I always walked on the other side of her, Richard Wilson taking the other side of Miss Millward, and Fergus roving here and there according to his fancy. And after a while she became more friendly, and at length I succeeded in securing her attention almost entirely to myself, and then I was happy indeed, for whenever she did condescend to converse, I liked to listen. Where her opinions and sentiments tallied with mine, it was her extreme and good sense, her exquisite taste and feeling that delighted me. Where they differed, it was still her uncompromising boldness in the avowal or defense of that difference, her eagerness and keenness that piqued my fancy, and even when she angered me by her unkind words or looks, and her uncharitable conclusions respecting me, it only made me the more dissatisfied with myself for having so unfavorably impressed her, and the more desirous to vindicate my character and disposition in her eyes, and, if possible, to win her esteem. At length our walk was ended. The increasing height and boldness of the hills had for some time intercepted the prospect, but on gaining the summit of the steep acclivity and looking downward, an opening lay before us, and the deep blue sea burst upon our sight. Deep violet blue, not deadly calm, but covered with glinting breakers, diminutive white specks twinkling on its bosom, and scarcely to be distinguished by the keenest vision from the little sea mews that sported above, their white wings glittering in the sunshine. Only 1 or 2 vessels were visible, and those were far away. I looked at my companion to see what she thought of this glorious scene. She said nothing, but she stood still and fixed her eyes upon it with a gaze that assured me she was not disappointed. She had very fine eyes, by the by. I don't know whether I've told you before, but they were full of soul, large, clear, and nearly black, not brown, but very dark gray. A cool, reviving breeze blew from the sea, soft, pure, salubrious. It waved her drooping ringlets and imparted a livelier color to her usually too pallid lip and cheek. She felt its exhilarating influence, and so did I. I felt it tingling through my frame, but dared not give way to it while she remained so quiet. There was an aspect of subdued exhilaration in her face that kindled into a smile of exalted, glad intelligence as her eyes met mine. Never had she looked so lovely. Never had my heart so warmly cleaved to her as now. Had we been left 2 minutes longer standing there alone, I cannot answer for the consequences. Happily for my discretion, perhaps for my enjoyment during the remainder of the day, we were speedily summoned to the repast, a very respectable collation, which Rose, assisted by Miss Wilson and Eliza, who, having shared her seat in the carriage, had arrived with her a little before the rest, had set out upon an elevated platform overlooking the sea and sheltered from the hot sun by a shelving rock and overhanging trees. Mrs. Graham seated herself at a distance from me. Eliza was my nearest neighbor. She exerted herself to be agreeable in her gentle, unobtrusive way, and was no doubt as fascinating and charming as ever, if I could only have felt it. But soon my heart began to warm towards her once again, and we were all very merry and happy together, as far as I could see, throughout the protracted social meal. When it was over, Rose summoned Fergus to help her to gather up the fragments and the knives, dishes, etc., and restore them to the baskets. And Mrs. Graham took her camp stool and drawing materials, and having begged Miss Millward to take charge of her precious son, and strictly enjoined him not to wander from his new guardian's side, she left us and proceeded along the steep stony hill to a loftier, more precipitous eminence at some distance, whence a still finer prospect was to be had, where she preferred taking her sketch, though some of the ladies told her it was a frightful place and advised her not to attempt it. When she was gone, I felt as if there was to be no more fun, though it's difficult to say what she had contributed to the hilarity of the party. No jests and little laughter had escaped her lips, but her smile had animated my mirth. A keen observation or a cheerful word from her had insensibly sharpened my wits and thrown an interest over all that was done and said by the rest. Even my conversation with Eliza had been enlivened by her presence, though I knew it not, and now that she was gone, Eliza's playful nonsense ceased to amuse me, nay, grew wearisome to my soul, and I grew weary of amusing her. I felt myself drawn by an irresistible attraction to that distant point where the fair artist sat and plied her solitary task, and not long did I attempt to resist it. While my little neighbor was exchanging a few words with Miss Wilson, I rose and cannily slipped away. A few rapid strides and a little act of clambering soon brought me to the place where she was seated, a narrow ledge of rock at the very verge of the cliff, which descended with a steep, precipitous slant quite down to the rocky shore. She did not hear me coming. The falling of my shadow across her paper gave her an electric start. She looked hastily round. Any other lady of my acquaintance would have screamed under such sudden alarm. "Oh, I didn't know it was you. Why did you startle me so?" said she, somewhat testily. "I hate anybody to come upon me so unexpectedly." "Why, what did you take me for?" said I. "If I had known you were so nervous, I would have been more cautious, but, well, never mind. What did you come for? Are they all coming?" "No, this little ledge could scarcely contain them all." "I'm glad, for I'm tired of talking." "Oh, well, then I won't talk. I'll only sit and watch your drawing." "Oh, but you know I don't like that." "Then I'll content myself with admiring this magnificent prospect." She made no objection to this. and for some time sketched away in silence. But I could not help stealing a glance now and then from the splendid view at our feet to the elegant white hand that held the pencil, and the graceful neck and the glossy raven curls that drooped over the paper. Now, thought I, if I had but a pencil and a morsel of paper, I could make a lovelier sketch than hers, admitting I had the power to delineate faithfully what is before me. But though this satisfaction was denied me, I was very well content to sit beside her there and say nothing. "Are you there still, Mr. Markham?" said she at length, looking round upon me, for I was seated a little behind on a mossy projection of the cliff. "Why don't you go and amuse yourself with your friends?" "Because I am tired of them, like you, and I shall have enough of them tomorrow, or at any time hence, but you I may not have the pleasure of seeing again for I know not how long." "What was Arthur doing when you came away?" "He was with Miss Millward when you left him, all right, but hoping mamma would not be long away." "You didn't entrust him to me, by the by," I grumbled, "though I had the honour of much longer acquaintance. But Miss Millward has the art of conciliating and amusing children," I carelessly added, "if she is good for nothing else." "Miss Millward has many estimable qualities, which such as you cannot be expected to perceive or appreciate. Will you tell Arthur that I shall come in a few minutes? If that be the case, I will wait, with your permission, till those few minutes are past, and then I can assist you to descend this difficult path." "Thank you. I always manage best on such occasions without assistance." "But at least I can carry your stool and sketch book." She did not deny me this favor, but I was rather offended at her evident desire to be rid of me, and was beginning to repent of my pertinacity, when she somewhat appeased me by consulting my taste and judgment about some doubtful matter in her drawing. My opinion, happily, met her approbation, and the improvement I suggested was adopted without hesitation. "I have often wished in vain," said she, "for another judgment to appeal to when I could scarcely trust the direction of my own eye and head, they having been so long occupied with the contemplation of a single object, as to become almost incapable of forming a proper idea respecting it." "That," reply I, "is only one of many evils to which a solitary life exposes us." "True," said she, and again we relapsed into silence. About 2 minutes later, however, she declared her sketch completed and closed the book. On returning to the scene of our repast, we found all the company had deserted it, with the exception of three: Mary Millward, Richard Wilson, and Arthur Graham. The younger gentleman lay fast asleep with his head pillowed on the lady's lap. The other was seated beside her with a pocket edition of some classic author in his hand. He never went anywhere without such a companion wherewith to improve his leisure moments. All time seemed lost that was not devoted to study, or exacted by his physical nature for the bare support of life. Even now he could not abandon himself to the enjoyment of that pure air and balmy sunshine, that splendid prospect, and those soothing sounds, the music of the waves and of the soft wind in the sheltering trees above him, not even with a lady by his side, though not a very charming one, I will allow. He must pull out his book and make the most of his time, while digesting his temperate meal and reposing his weary limbs unused to so much exercise. Perhaps, however, he spared a moment to exchange a word or a glance with his companion now and then. At any rate, she did not appear at all resentful of his conduct, for her homely features wore an expression of unusual cheerfulness and serenity, and she was studying his pale, thoughtful face with great complacency when we arrived. The journey homeward was by no means so agreeable to me as the former part of that day. For now Mrs. Graham was in the carriage, and Eliza Millward was the companion of my walk. She had observed my preference for the young widow, and evidently felt herself neglected. She did not manifest her chagrin by keen reproaches, bitter sarcasms, or pouting, sullen silences. Any or all of these I could easily have endured, or lightly laughed away. But she showed it by a kind of gentle melancholy, a mild reproachful sadness that cut me to the heart. I tried to cheer her up. and apparently succeeded in some degree before the walk was over. But in the very act, my conscience reproved me, knowing, as I did, that sooner or later the tie must be broken, and this was only nourishing false hopes and putting off the evil day. When the pony carriage had approached as near Wildfell Hall as the road would permit, unless indeed it proceeded up the long rough lane which Mrs. Graham would not allow, the young widow and her son alighted, relinquishing the driver's seat to Rose, and I persuaded Eliza to take the latter's place. Having put her comfortably in, bid her take care of the evening air, and wished her a kind good night. I felt considerably relieved, and hastened to offer my services to Mrs. Graham to carry her apparatus up the fields, but she had already hung her camp stool on her arm and taken her sketch-book in her hand, and insisted upon bidding me adieu then and there with the rest of the company. But this time she declined my proffered aid in so kind and friendly a manner that I almost forgave her. End of chapter 7.